Cranston Fire.
Hi, we need a rescue, please. 145 Pleasant Street in Cranston. My brother had a seizure, and he's been in it for quite a bit.
Is that a single-family home?
It's a one-family home.
Okay.
It's a duplex, actually.
145 Pleasant Street.
Yes.
On the way.
Thank you.
Sean made a call to Amy, Natalia's mom, who he had also rekindled his relationship with, and she offered to pick him up a sub from his favorite sandwich shop. And shortly after this, she and Natalia went to Sean's duplex to drop off his food. Now, Sean's living situation is very important in this case. Sean lived in Cranston, Rhode Island, in the basement unit of a ranch-style duplex located on Pleasant Street. He subleased this unit from a man named Armand Rouleau. Armand occupied one side of the duplex, and he was frequently bringing his girlfriend around, Lynn Halal, starting around early 2005. And for some reason, Sean and Lynn seemed to have problems. The exact reason that the two of them didn't get along is unknown. So after Amy and Natalia dropped off his sandwich, Sean handed her $160 to go towards child support. The two of them spoke for a little while outside of his place and then decided on making plans for later that evening. But when they get there, Natalia tells her mom that she has a really bad headache. So they decide against going. They decided they would go the following night, but the thing is, he didn't want to just sit at home that night. More specifically, he didn't want to be home that night because Armand and Lynn were going to be there, and he did not want to be around Lynn. So he asked Amy to drop him off at a local pub called Billy's Frosted Mug. Now, Amy did agree to take him there, but she was hesitant because Sean was just starting to get sober again. But he told her that he wasn't going to drink, although, as you'll learn, he did end up giving in to his temptation and ended up drinking at the Frosted Mug. By 6:10, Sean was dropped off at the pub, and unfortunately, this was the last time that Natalia would see her father alive. So the next morning, Sean was scheduled to be at work between 7 and 8 a.m., and he never showed up. A little before 6 p.m., Sean's sister, Karen, and her nephew showed up at the duplex to talk to Sean. And when they got there, they were greeted by Armand. And she says that he ran up to them and shouted, "Come in quick. Sean has been having a seizure for over an hour." And so, of course, she quickly goes inside. And when she does, she is shocked by what she sees. She found Sean laying in a pool of his own on the floor in just his boxers. Of course, she called 911 right away at 5:51 p.m. to report what happened. Now, if you're like me, you're already thinking, why didn't Armand call 911 if Sean has been on the floor in his own having a seizure for over an hour? Emergency responders arrived at 145 Pleasant Street and attempted to perform life-saving measures. But it was clear by Sean's labored breathing and snoring sounds that his airway was obstructed. The image on screen should kind of give you a better idea of what the duplex was like and where Sean was. I think it's helpful. EMS noticed that there was a significant amount of vomit around him, as well as dried, crusted coming from his mouth or nose area extending to his right ear. And the fact that some of his had already dried up is really important to remember. It's also important to note that there was coming from between his toes, and this is pretty confusing considering he was allegedly having a seizure, so that part of this is unexplained. Another one is that first responders had requested backup from police because Sean was having a combative seizure, but then it was also reported that he was unconscious. Not to mention, which I will explain here shortly, Sean also had many visible injuries all over his body. And because Sean was still alive when they got there, obviously their main focus was to save his life, not to process the scene as a crime scene. But unfortunately, as you'll learn, it took them 4 days to come to this conclusion, and by then, obviously the scene was completely contaminated. Now, as rescue efforts are going on, Armand tells police that he has no idea what happened and that he hasn't seen Sean in over an hour. According to this story, he says that Sean was watching a baseball game in his room around 5 p.m. and that when he came back downstairs, he found Sean on the ground, and he claimed he thought he was sleeping. He claims it wasn't until Karen came over and she finds Sean laying in a pool of his own that he realized he was seizing. And then he claims to have called 911. Now, to be clear, Armand never called 911, even though he said he did. Oh, and Sean didn't have a TV in his room, so how could he have been watching baseball? He then explains that Sean had a history of seizures and dependency, and that he hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary coming from Sean's unit. Now, unlike the rest of his statement, the part about Sean having a history of seizures is true. But at this point, there was no real concern that Armand could have anything to do with it. So just like the scene, the officers didn't try to gain any additional information, at least not yet. So once Sean arrived at the hospital, they did imaging of his brain, and a large amount of appeared to be pooling inside his skull, along with a 2-inch skull fracture to the right side of his head. And it was initially believed that the large amount of found around Sean's body and inside his skull happened as the result of him falling mid-seizure. And of course, while this could happen, his injuries don't align with that being the case. A seizure victim will almost always fall forward or backward when going down, and Sean's blunt force trauma was on the sides of his head. He also had a mysterious dent-like injury to the left side of his skull, and it almost looked as if he was hit with a heavy object. But regardless of how the trauma happened, surgeons responded to the injury immediately. Sean had a midline shift, meaning his brain was no longer in the center of his skull, which is very, very dangerous and scary. And unfortunately, their efforts were not enough. They were able to stabilize his vitals, but the damage was just too severe. A rapid test was performed, and it was then confirmed that he did have opiates and barbiturates in his system, and this would also be later confirmed by the toxicology report. But despite what looked like a induced seizure, Amy knew that something much more sinister could be at play. Several nurses told Amy that Sean's injuries were not consistent with a fall, and the neurosurgeon even asked her if it's possible he was in a fight. Natalia says the doctors never believed that it was a seizure in the first place. And to be clear, it was never confirmed that Sean had a seizure. So that Tuesday, July 25th, 2006 at 1:24 p.m., 34-year-old Sean O'Brien passed away. At one point, he was removed from life support and was breathing on his own, but the damage was just too much, and eventually he succumbed to his injuries. So his mother called the funeral home right away to make arrangements. But when she did, she found out that the coroner had already accepted his body and that they were going to be performing an autopsy, which was great news. But Amy wasn't going to take any chances leaving the investigative work up to the police. So on the same afternoon that Sean passed, she and Aaron, they drove over to Pleasant Street to grab some of Sean's belongings and also talk to Armand, who was actually outside already when they got there with his dog. Right away, they tell him that Sean didn't make it and that doctors said it looked like he had been hit in the head. And right away, Armand apparently got very defensive. He told them that he was positive that he had died as the result of a seizure, and then went into his story again. But this time, Amy was there to correct him. When he started to say that Sean had come back that night after Amy dropped him off, she stopped him and told him that she had only brought him to the pub. She never brought him back. And that's when he changed his story and said that he actually saw him walking home with a pack of beers under his arm. And while he was telling them this version of the story, he seemed to be questioning himself. He said things like, he was wearing a hat, or was he? They also said that he wouldn't make eye contact with them, and he appeared to have some scratches on his face and a Band-Aid on one of his fingers. There was also something else they noticed that they thought was weird about Armand's dog, Floyd. The dog had a missing patch of fur on his tail, and they started to wonder if maybe it was stained with and he had tried to shave it off. Because even though Floyd was Armand's dog, he actually spent most of his time actually, down in the basement with Sean. And he was the type of dog to bark at anything and everything, whether that was someone coming into the house, someone at the door, or Sean having a seizure. But what's weird is, according to neighbors, no one ever heard him bark. And not only that, but a few hours before Sean was found by Karen on Saturday afternoon, his mom was looking for him, and she stopped over at the house. And she knocked on the door, and the dog didn't bark. And she thought that was weird because the dog always barked. And also, no one ever came to the door. So the day after making these discoveries, Amy and her sister went to the Cranston Police Department to tell them everything. And keep in mind, this was now Wednesday and Sean had been found Saturday. And this was the first time that police were legitimately considering that there could have been foul play involved in Sean's death. And within hours of making this report, the house was sealed off as a crime scene. But I'm sure anyone listening is thinking what I'm thinking. It's been 4 days at this point. How are they going to get any reliable evidence after days of contamination? That same morning, Wednesday, July 26th, the medical examiner completed their autopsy and determined that Sean's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. But as for manner of death, of course, they listed it as undetermined because it was unclear how this had happened. And that's really what has been the most difficult and frustrating roadblock that Natalia has had to deal with when trying to get justice for her father. Because the manner of death is listed as undetermined, the police essentially had no reason to pursue the case any further when it got challenging, but they didn't give up just yet at this point. Cranston police did conduct an early investigation and had reason to believe that Armand and Lynn were their two main persons of interest. Detectives even got a search warrant for their home, and in that warrant, they quoted findings from the autopsy, which stated the magnitude and extent of the trauma to his head was inconsistent with a fall caused by a seizure. Natalia believes that Armand was spoken to on the 26th, the same day that Amy and Aaron went to the police with what they had found. Armand did end up consenting to a search of his home, but he also invoked his right to a lawyer. And while one or two officers conducted the search of the home to try and confirm that Amy and Aaron were reporting, another one or two officers sat outside to interview Lynn. Specifically, she was asked if Armand ever told her how Sean was lying on the ground the first time that he entered the basement. But when they asked her this, Armand immediately cut in and tried to answer the question for her. But keep in mind, at this point, he's already invoked his right to a lawyer, so police can't speak to him. And of course, they explain that to him, but that doesn't stop him from wanting to speak. And at this point, he says he changed his mind and no longer wants an attorney. And remember earlier when I mentioned that Aaron and Amy noticed that Armand had scratches on his face? Well, detectives saw that too. And this is what Lynn had to say about it. She admitted that on Friday night, she and Armand had got in an argument, and that she was the one who scratched up his face. But regardless of whether or not she was telling the truth, she admitted to an officer that she broke the law. The officer she told this information to was told he needed to arrest her and bring her in. But by the time he was going to make this arrest, she was nowhere to be found. Now, we'll likely never know where she went and where she was for the rest of that day, but the following day she was brought in and arrested. And although she isn't charged with anything related to Sean's death, at this point she is charged with misdemeanor assault and battery for attacking her boyfriend. That day they also executed an official search of the home where they collected several pieces of evidence and even took Lynn's car in for processing. And then they got some bad news. The medical examiner told them that they weren't going to change his manner of death from undetermined to homicide, and essentially his hands were tied. He couldn't rule Sean's death a homicide because the police couldn't provide him with a clear picture of what happened. And the police's hands were tied because without it being declared a homicide, they couldn't prosecute anyone. So this is the circular battle that Natalia has been facing.
So unfortunately, I've stalled out. It's a frustrating and sad place to be in. All I'm asking for is people to look at my dad's case again and help me understand why it doesn't all add up. When I started all of this, I had a few goals, some bigger than others. I really want my dad's case solved, and I want answers as to what happened to him in July 2006. I want to know what happened so maybe I can sleep at night without staying up and always picturing the worst possible scenarios. I just want to know which one is true.